There's more to mental health than pills, prescriptions, and visiting a counselor or psychologist. Depression, and specifically major depressive disorder, are various serious conditions that are currently the leading cause of disability around the world. Welcome to sammillerscience, where you're joining me nearly 2 decades into my personal journey to bridge the gap between macros, metabolism, muscle, and medicine. If you're joining me, thanks for trusting me to elevate your health and realize your true potential. Each week and inside every episode, I'll be sharing methods and models from my coaching journey and my personal experience, as well as the science that you need to achieve whatever specific goals you're working on in your life. Let's jump in to today's show. But what most people miss is how depression is closely intertwined with inflammation and neuroinflammation. Major depression can make people feel completely empty, lose interest in things they were once previously excited about, and get to a point where there's even a lack of motivation to get out of bed in the morning. While depression is multifactorial, genome-wide association studies have failed to produce consistent findings on genetics and depression. So it seems that the environment and what you're exposed to and how you live your life, things like traumatic experiences, stress, diet, and activity levels, are all more important than genetic factors at this time. Many hypotheses have been put forth to explain major depressive disorder, and many of them have significant overlap, and some of that overlap is inflammation. If you listen to any of my podcasts on omega-3s, EPA and DHA, and depression, you'll have an idea of how inflammation can affect mood. But today, I'm going to unpack and dive into how inflammation can alter neurotransmitter levels and induce a sort of neurodegeneration that can potentially result in major depressive disorder or mental health conditions. So we'll first start with an overview of serotonin and how it's created and what it does specifically. Then we'll cover the basics of inflammation that you need to understand and grasp what's actually happening from an internal health perspective. We'll break down how inflammation can lead to decreased serotonin and neurodegeneration, and then just dive into some common sources of inflammation and what you can do about it. So first, when it comes to serotonin, most people think about their mood, their happiness, and this particular neurotransmitter is what usually comes to mind. It's probably the most well-known neurotransmitter in the mental health space and just public health sphere. It's casually known as the happiness chemical, and serotonin actually has tons of other functions in the body, like regulating GI function and bone metabolism. But in a certain area of the brain, it's definitely responsible for a good bit of that mood regulation. In a simplified version of serotonin signaling, it's released from a presynaptic neuron into the space between neurons called the cleft. This is where it can bind to the next neuron and cause a nerve impulse, or it can be taken back up to the previous neuron and either it's recycled or broken down. So a lot of the drugs for depression target this exact system. So like SSRIs, for example, prevent serotonin from being taken back up into the previous neuron, so it's able to hang around a little bit longer in that cleft and therefore cause more effects. MAOI drugs inhibit the compound that breaks down serotonin within the presynaptic neuron. Since these drugs do work to some degree for depression, it's fairly obvious that serotonin has a major role. So before we dive in on how inflammation could potentially affect depression, a general overview of what inflammation is going to be pretty important before we get into any jargon related to inflammation in the immune system. If you're not as familiar with how inflammation works in the body, it's basically immune system activation. Whether you sprain your ankle or have another injury, when you have swelling, that experiences immune cells rushing to the site of the injury. And inflammation that doesn't resolve, or chronic inflammation, is where the immune system response is dysregulated and lasts much longer than it should, which is what causes the damage to the tissues. As we talk in today's episode, you'll hear about cytokines, and you can basically think of these as hormones of the immune system. There are pro-inflammatory cytokines and anti-inflammatory cytokines. The pro-inflammatory cytokines signal immune cells that there's an issue and draw immune cells to a site in the body, which initiates the inflammatory response. Anti-inflammatory cytokines tell immune cells, hey, we're no longer needed here, resolve the inflammation, and let's go home. Whereas cytokines are mostly released by certain immune cells to further the inflammatory response, but they can also be released by other cells in the body, including even in the nervous system and the brain. And so with that basic knowledge, we can have a better understanding of how this applies to mental health. Anytime you have an inflammatory environment in the body, whether it's from chronic stress, gut issues, or anything else, and we'll talk a little bit more for the reasons as I break down this process, but when you have that inflammatory environment, there's a good chance that you have increased cytokines in the brain. There either can be systemic cytokines from inflammation, and this crosses the blood-brain barrier, or cells within the brain can actually release those cytokines themselves. So this draws an immune response and causes inflammation at the level of the brain. It's been noted that people with major depressive disorder have increased levels circulating of these pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin 1 beta, interleukin 6, and others. This is actually little known, but some antidepressants like SSRIs don't just exert their effects through having increased serotonin available. They're also anti-inflammatory in a way and upregulate anti-inflammatory cytokines while down-regulating pro-inflammatory cytokines. So now let's talk a little bit about serotonin. The brain uses the amino acid tryptophan, which you get from food, to create serotonin. However, it's not the only fate of tryptophan. It can actually go down a different pathway based on certain circumstances in the body. And one of those circumstances is when there's brain inflammation. So cytokines like tumor necrosis factor alpha and others can stimulate an enzyme called IDO. But this IDO enzyme, when active, stimulates tryptophan to go down a different pathway. So think of this as like a fork in the road in your body in terms of your biochemistry, almost stealing from its ability to create serotonin. Instead, tryptophan gets converted into a molecule known as kynurenine, which then gets converted into kynurenate, and kynurenate is actually neuroprotective, while quinolinate is neurodegenerative. These molecules can also be interconverted into one another, and so in some folks, these elevated pro-inflammatory cytokines will shift things towards quinolinate, and that's more the neurodegenerative molecule. When this quinolinate keeps being created over time, it causes neurodegeneration in the regions of the brain, such as the hippocampus, which is involved in learning, memory, and the striatum, which is involved in the sensation of reward. So it makes sense that depressed individuals experience less of that sense of reward when it comes to things they enjoy, as well as having less focus and memory. Since 2019, my team and I have specifically produced this show for listeners like you, people who care about health and who want to make a difference in the world, whether it's just for their own health and their family, or if you're actively working with others in their transformation. Producing this show has been something that my team and I have done and continue to put out best-in-class content specifically for you. If it's been enjoyable, entertaining, or helped you pass the time as you do chores, travel, or navigate daily life, the greatest compliment that you could give my team is a 5-star rating and review and sharing the show with someone else who's like-minded. Bringing those people back to the content and community is the greatest way that we can continue to share this work with the world. Unlike a lot of shows, you're not getting these product and supplement advertisements every 5 minutes, and we take the best-in-class research and data and bring it directly to you based on my clinical coaching experience and things that actually apply to the real world in digestible ways that make sense. And we translate these complex concepts so that they are immediately actionable and things you can put into practice in your daily life. If you enjoy the show, please consider sharing it or leaving a 5-star rating and review. My team and I appreciate it. Let's jump back into today's show. In addition to that, chronically elevated cortisol in and of itself from stressful situations causes the atrophy of the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for personality, expression, decision-making, social behavior, and causes hypertrophy of the amygdala, which is involved in the fear response. High inflammation and high cortisol generally coupled more often than you think, so this is almost like a flurry or snowball of mechanisms leading to brain changes that result in depression. And increased inflammation can come from a number of different places, and I do have a couple different podcasts that cover inflammation in depth, but in short, a poor diet can lead to changes in the gut microbiome and permeability that can lead to systemic inflammation. In addition, if that same poor diet makes you obese and you have increased levels of adiposity, that higher level of body fat can lead to low-grade inflammation as well, especially if the obese person is sedentary and not exercising. Last but not least, chronic stress is going to be highly pro-inflammatory as well. And I typically cover things like chronic stress and inflammation in other episodes. So if you're not following Science, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of that. Now, if you or your client is not necessarily obese, but has gut issues, then this needs to be addressed first and foremost in order to improve mental health. And I have different episodes on microbiome mastery, how to include different types of elimination diets, and even basic supplementation that can help there. In addition to a healthy lifestyle for individuals who are struggling with mood and mental health, EPA and DHA from fish oil can help modify the cytokine profile to be more anti-inflammatory. Supplementation with high-dose fish oil, EPA and DHA, can potentially help to modify the cytokine profile to be more anti-inflammatory. And this supplementation has been shown to alleviate depression to some degree in those with higher circulating inflammatory cytokines in some of the human research that we have so far. So we certainly have no shortage of potential sources of inflammation. It can stem from chronic stress, poor diet, gut issues, being overweight or obese, infection can play a role, or other chronic illnesses can cause increases in pro-inflammatory cytokines. These elevations cause tryptophan to be converted into kynurenate instead of serotonin, and kynurenate is further converted into quinolinate, which has neurodegenerative effects in multiple areas of the brain. In addition, high cortisol will also cause negative brain structural changes like the hypertrophying of the amygdala and impacting the hippocampus, which can impact folks who experience mental health symptoms and depression. As you can see inside today's episode, physiology plays a very important role in impacting our psychology and mental health. And this is where health professionals and people who manage things like nutrition, exercise, internal health, and lifestyle can play such an important role in terms of the mood and well-being of individuals. If you enjoyed today's episode, learning about the brain structural changes, how neuroinflammation impacts our neurotransmitters, and even how basic lifestyle and supplement changes can improve our health, you're someone who would probably be a good fit for our functional nutrition and metabolism specialization program. This live program helps to mentor and develop health coaches into becoming in-demand experts to deal with some of the evolving issues inside our industry and keep up during evolving times. Things like labs, peptides, genetics, and even this conversation around mental health is becoming very important, but very few realize how some of these biochemical and physiological factors are precursors to so many of the issues that are being talked about online. And so first, in order to help people achieve the physical change that they want or the quality of life changes that they want in their transformation, we have to understand what's going on from an internal health perspective. And many coaches are over-prepared on things like macros and under-prepared on things like physiology. So if you want to learn more and really step into that advanced practice nutrition and learn more about functional health as a whole, you want to check out FNMS, and you can do so by grabbing the link in the show notes or head over to metabolismschool.com for more. I appreciate you guys tuning into today's episode. If you enjoyed it or you have someone who is interested in learning more about mental health, please share it with them and drop a 5-star rating and review to help more like-minded individuals find this content. And ideally, that way they're able to apply it to themselves or anyone in their lives. I appreciate you guys. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode, and I'll talk to you in the next show. This show is designed to help you translate complex nutrition, fitness, and physiology concepts into leverage for your clients' goals or your own personal goals. This podcast is for online education, meaning this podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. And no doctor-patient or coach-client relationship is formed through listening to this episode. The use of information in this podcast and the show notes or the reliance on the information provided is done at the listener's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and is for educational purposes only. Always consult your physician before beginning any exercise program, and users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such condition. By accessing this podcast and any other episode, the listener acknowledges that the entire contents and design of this podcast are the property of Oracle Athletic Science and should not be used or retransmitted without permission of Oracle Athletic Science. This is protected under U.S. and international copyright and trademark laws. Except as where otherwise provided herein, users of this podcast may save and use the information contained in this podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without prior written permission of Oracle Athletic Science and Sam Miller, which may be requested through the contact information in the show notes. By accessing this podcast, the listener acknowledges that Oracle Athletic Science makes no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast, and coaches and listeners understand that this information may change over time with different research and anecdotal practices in the field. It is the listener's responsibility to stay up to date on this information. As always, this show is designed to help you, and I appreciate you listening to every episode. Simply understand it's for general informational and educational purposes, and we'll talk to you in the next episode.